Hello everybody and welcome back to my history channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at part 2 of the Great Northern War by Kings and Generals. This one is subtitled The Battle of Klisov. I don't know how you pronounce that exactly. 1702. As always, I will include a link to the original content in the description down below, as well as a link to part 1 because this is part 2 of a 6-part series. So, I'm not going to do too much intro here. Last video we went from the background of the Great Northern War up until the great Russian defeat at the Battle of Narva. So we'll be picking up in the wake of Narva and seeing what happened afterwards. With that said, let's just get into it.
With the stunning victory at the Battle of Narva, the Swedish army confirmed that it was a force to be reckoned with. However, the war
Winged
was not
Hussars.
over. Augustus II of Saxony, the elected monarch of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, still remained, and Charles was eager to defeat him as well. Charles, in spite of his young age, presented himself as a capable commander, and it became evident that his adversaries gravely underestimated him.
Big
Now,
time.
the young king wanted to bring the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to its knees. If you want to learn about history, the sponsor of today's video, Blinkist, is a great way to do it. Work towards being your best self, improve your knowledge, and learn about the world around you with Blinkist.
Alright, we're going to skip over the advertisement since this is an older video, and we'll pick up on the other side. I use Blinkist, I actually like it. It just gives you a Reader's Digest version of a lot of literature that's out there. I go through a lot of the nonfiction stuff. It gives me an idea. They're fairly short usually. It does give you a good idea of what the main book would have in it. It's a great way to preview books before you buy them if you're interested in specific topics. And it's a good way just to learn general overviews of topics fast. So if you're interested in Blinkist, go ahead and go down to the description below, go to King and General's original video, and you can watch the ad there and get the more details. And please head over there anyway and show Kings and Generals some support. These guys do a lot of great work. Anyway, let's continue on.
While Charles and his forces settled around Dorpat for winter quarters, news of his victory at Narva created shockwaves throughout Europe. Peter the Great, realizing that Augustus II might already be trying to enter peace negotiations with Sweden, offered the Saxon elector financial and military help in return for staying in the war. By the campaigning season, in May, reinforcements from Sweden arrived in Revel, and they joined the main Swedish army in the middle of June. Having united his forces, Charles set off for Riga on June 17th. However, as the Russians frequently raided and harassed Swedish positions, he was forced to leave behind 6,000 men in Ingria and Estonia under the command of Schlippenbach.
And that's not surprising. When you're in hostile territory, you've got to secure your rear. You've got to keep your supply lines open, and you've got to make sure the territory you've already gotten a footing in stays open to you.
Although the Saxon army besieged Riga from the beginning of the war, they did not have the manpower or the equipment to take the well-fortified city. After learning of the arrival of the Swedish army in Livonia in late 1700, the Saxon troops retreated beyond the Duna River, modern Daugava, for winter quarters. During the winter season, the Saxons, under the command of Steinau, heavily fortified their side of the river in preparation for a possible Swedish crossing. The Swedish army arrived near Riga on July 14th, and Charles, being aware that making a direct crossing would be a huge risk and quite costly in manpower, opted to weaken the Saxon defense first. Several hundred of his horsemen, as well as part of Riga's garrison, were ordered to head upriver towards Kockenhusen, a seemingly ideal place for a crossing. As a result, Steinau was forced to stretch his forces thin to cover both the possible crossing points at Kockenhusen and the one near Riga.
Yeah, and that's a good move on Charles's part. River crossings are dangerous. You're exposed while you're crossing the rivers. So by sending some troops over to another crossing, he's forcing his enemy to also divide up in order to defend multiple crossings. And that helps give you an advantage, especially, and I don't know the specifics on this particular case, if you can convince your enemy that you're sending more than you really are, which is what I think is very commonly going to happen in a situation like this, is you try to do it. It's basically what the Allies do at Calais in the build-up towards D-Day. They try to get the Germans watching in one area and forcing them to watch a much wider area than they really can easily defend. That's kind of what's happening here. I don't know how aware the Saxons were of how many troops that Charles actually sent over there. They just knew that there was Swedes getting ready to cross at another point, so they have to split their forces.
On the evening of the 18th, Swedish forces embarked on transport ships at Fassenholm and began their crossing. Meanwhile, engineers were ordered to create a makeshift floating bridge across the river as well. The crossing Swedish army, led by Charles himself, consisted of around 7,000 grenadiers and only 100 cavalry, while their Saxon counterpart had a 20,000-strong army on their side.
Think about that for a minute. You're trying to cross a river with basically 7,000 men and a few horses against an army of 20,000. This should be a bloodbath. The Swedes should be blown out of the water, quite literally. But Charles is Charles. He is... I don't know how he does it, to be honest.
As soon as the transport boats reached
time.
The middle of the river, the Saxon artillery started firing at them. However, the artillery barrage would be ineffective. At the same time, the Swedish artillery, placed both on their side of the river and on two riverboats, began shelling the Saxon redoubts. Awaiting the Swedish assault, a Saxon army under the command of Steinau drew up in two lines between the two redoubts. The army that Steinau managed to gather in such a short period of time consisted only of about 3,500 men, and it was made up mostly of infantry and a small amount of cavalry on the flanks. Charles, seeing that such a force was descending upon his men, drew up around 3,000 grenadiers and prepared for the Saxon assault. The Saxons attacked the Swedish army furiously. However, their assault was halted, and they were forced to retreat after the Swedish army fired several volleys. This allowed for more Swedish troops to disembark and join the main body of the army, while at the same time, more of Steinau's men joined the fight as well. Undaunted by their initial failure, the entirety of the Saxon infantry drew up in a line and charged, meeting the same fate once again. On their third try, the Saxon cavalry tried to attack Charles's right flank. However, a part of the Swedish cavalry that just disembarked managed to push it back. This pattern of Saxon assaults and retreats dragged on until 7 AM on the next day, when the Swedish army captured the first redoubt. Steinau deemed it impossible to defend such a position and subsequently ordered a retreat. The majority of the Saxon army retreated unscathed to the forts of Dunamunda and Kobrin, as bad weather prevented the Swedish engineers from finishing the bridge in time so that their cavalry could assault the Saxon army. Still, the Saxons lost more than 2,000 in this action, while Charles's casualties were around 500.
Just amazing that he can pull this stuff off. I don't know if that says a lot about Charles or if it says a lot about the Saxon defense, but the fact that they can pull this off is just, it boggles my mind. Excuse me, I've got a hair loose or something. But like I said in the previous video, I'm not a military historian, so things like this just boggle my mind. I just don't really understand how he was able to pull that off. That should have been an easy victory for the Saxons. Vastly superior force, you got redoubts in position, your enemy is having to cross a river to get at you. Should have been an easy victory.
In the following days, Kobrin and Dunamunda fell to the Swedish army, with Kockenhusen and the rest of Livonia and Kurland falling into their hands in the next few weeks. A small Russian army under Repnin that was sent by Peter to support the Saxons retreated to the east without participating in the battle. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been neutral up until that point, with the majority of their magnates opposing the war with Sweden and using the liberum veto to avoid it. Charles himself was in a position of power at that moment and could have signed a peace treaty with Augustus. Aware of the elector's deceitful nature, the young Swedish king knew that there would be no peace with Poland for as long as Augustus remained king. Therefore, dethroning him seemed like the only option to secure Livonia and advance to Russia unhindered. It is also speculated that Charles had taken a personal disliking towards Augustus, as the two of them had quite opposite personalities.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the previous video. From what I understood, those two had a personal dislike, very, very strong personal dislike. But yeah, Charles, I mentioned this also in the first video, Augustus is king of Saxons, but he's also the head of the Polish-Lithuanian complex at this time. But there is a parliamentary body underneath him that has the ability to veto. So he's not an absolute monarch there as he is in Saxony, but he is still a ruler there.
The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was far from what it once was. The cracks on the internal political machine of the state were evident. Many of the magnates did not support their elected king, and some were even openly against him. In the beginning of autumn in 1701, as soon as Charles started advancing into Kurland, he was met by several minor Lithuanian nobles, asking him to avoid taking control of their lands in exchange for their logistical support. Lithuania was, at the time, divided between two powerful noble families, the Oginsky and the Sapieha.
Okay.
Augustus himself was at odds with the Sapieha family and allowed the Oginsky to raid their lands with impunity. The two counts of Sapieha, seeing an opportunity to protect their lands and expand their influence, met with Charles as well, offering their support in exchange for protection against Oginsky and the dethroning of Augustus. Although minor Swedish expeditions took place in Lithuania in the last few months of 1701, with Kaunas and Vilnius falling by January, no significant result was achieved, as Oginsky refused to give open battle and was still harassing the Swedish forces. By February of 1702, Charles returned to Kurland and started making preparations for his advance on Warsaw. Seeing the gravity of the situation, Augustus called for a diet in the capital, asking the Polish nobility for support.
Okay.
The diet did not resolve any crucial issues, with many magnates using that chance to voice their dissatisfaction with Augustus. Nevertheless, the nobility agreed to send 5 of their members to Charles to try and negotiate a peace once again, this time with the Dutch Republic's mediation. The 5 diplomats, some nobles and some members of the Catholic Church, met with Charles on several occasions. The divisions in the ranks of the Commonwealth were seen here as well. At first, the diplomats tried to convince Charles to agree to their peace terms. However, after several days, they started bickering among themselves, much to the Swedish king's annoyance.
That would be annoying.
Incensed by their disrespect, Charles halted all further negotiations and moved for Warsaw.
Yeah, if you're trying to treat with a foreign entity, you need to present a unified front. If you're clearly bickering among yourselves in front of him, not only is that going to be perceived as disrespectful, but it's also going to show that you're weak, you're divided, you're easily exploited, and Charles is a very aggressive individual. He's going to see that, and he's going to be like a shark smelling blood in the water.
Determined to take it. Having learned of the Swedish king's inflexibility, Augustus decided to leave Warsaw for the old capital of Krakow. With Warsaw falling to the Swedes by late spring, Augustus attempted a last-ditch effort to secure peace and sent the Archbishop of Gniezno, Cardinal Radziejowski. Unknown to Augustus, the cardinal had already exchanged several letters with Charles, assuring him of his friendly intentions. Whether the cardinal intended to betray Augustus at that point still remains unclear. Furthermore, after spending some time with Charles, the cardinal advised him against dethroning the king, as the Polish people would not only change their attitude towards the Swedes, but also that they would never view the new king as legitimate.
Okay, that is something I can comment on because that happened a lot in history. We see it in Russia in the time of troubles with Boris Godunov. Because he was not a descendant of the Rurik line, he was not seen as a legitimate czar by many of the common people. And that helped destabilize the nation, among other things. There was so much going on, but that's one of the contributing factors, is that he is not viewed as legitimate by the people. He is not given his position through the correct method, which is, in the case of Russia at this time, it would have been through family lines. So that can help to stabilize a situation much worse. So even though people may not like Augustus, they're going to like it even less if somebody else is put in that position through improper means, because the legitimacy of your ruler tends to be very important. I mean, we're talking about an era where a lot of nobility are still seen as having a divine right. Their rule is sanctified by God, by the church, and if you don't go through the correct process, if you're not putting the king is not being elevated through the correct means, there's going to be discontent.
As Augustus still was not decisively defeated, Charles did not give too much thought to the cardinal's advice, but focused on the war instead. It was the middle of June when Charles began his march towards Krakow. He reached the town of Kielce, where he learned that Augustus linked up with the Polish army under Lubomirski at Sandomierz. After an unsuccessful Saxon ambush on a Swedish scouting unit, the Swedes learned of Augustus's position at Klisov. On the morning of the 17th of July, Charles departed from Kielce at the head of his army, reaching the village of Opiece, which was 4 kilometers away from Klisov, on the evening of the same day. Even though the Swedish army was smaller and lacked cavalry, Charles wanted to attack. Ultimately, he heeded the advice of his generals and waited for one more day for his cavalry to arrive. As the Swedish cavalry arrived on the 18th, so did rumors about a Saxon attack, which was supposed to take place on the morning of the 19th. However,
this is Charles we're talking about. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I can guess. If he thinks the enemy can attack him, he can attack first.
The Saxon army had not turned up by 9 AM, so Charles drew up his army and began marching towards their positions at Klisov.
Yep,
he had
you're not coming to us, we're coming to you.
Men at his disposal, with about 8,000 grenadiers and 4,000 cavalry, as well as 4 artillery pieces. The army was drawn up in 2 lines. The cavalry was placed on the wings and the infantry in the center. The right wing was commanded by Charles XII himself, the center by von Lewin, and the left wing by Duke Frederick IV of Holstein-Gottorp. The majority of the Swedish army advanced through the forest towards Klisov, with only the left wing taking the more open route. Just as the Swedish left arrived on the plains outside Klisov, they were noticed by a Saxon cavalry regiment that was led by Augustus. As the Saxon elector was confident that only a small unit was advancing towards his positions, he lowered his guard and did not take the threat seriously. Charles, seeing the element of surprise as critical, ordered his cavalry to lower their standards and the infantry to lower their pikes, just as they passed onto the plains outside Klisov. Augustus fell for that trap as well, and perceived the Swedish army as only a reconnaissance unit.
That's not good, but it looks like he's pretty well set in and prepared. I'm not really familiar with this particular battle, other than I know that Charles is going to come out victorious, even though just glancing at it, it looked like he shouldn't.
The Saxon army consisted of 16,000 men, 9,000 of whom were infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Augustus also had an 8,000-strong Polish cavalry unit, consisting of 1,000 elite Winged Hussars, 3,000
I love the looks of the Hussars. Really impressive style. I've always admired the Hussars, not just from their look, but their effectiveness as well. So we're talking about, 25,000 forces arrayed against Charles?
500 dragoons, and 3,500 Cossacks and Wallachian light horse. The army of Augustus also had the majority of its infantry in the center and the cavalry on the flanks. The left wing was led by von Tremper, the center by Schulenberg, and the right by von Flemming, while the Polish units on the far right were led by Lubomirski. Augustus's forces occupied the higher ground, where they placed their 46 artillery pieces, and their position was also additionally protected by a chevaux de frise.
Alright, so they got high ground, they've got defensive works ready to help control a charge, and they've got plenty of artillery, and they've got a pretty substantial force. 17,000 of the Saxons, plus, 8,000 Polish troops, including the elite hussars.
At noon, Charles ordered his right wing to pass around the woodlot in front of it from the left side. Also the centre and left wing to advance directly towards the Saxon positions. Now aware that this was not just a reconnaissance unit, but the main Swedish army, Augustus ordered his artillery to fire on the Swedish forces. Right before the Saxon camp, there was a dense marsh from the village of Kokot to the village of Vyszbica, which hindered the Swedish advance. The Saxons were in a very advantageous position at that point, their artillery wreaking havoc upon the Swedish army. Charles XII, seeing the absolute impossibility of attacking the enemy directly, ordered his army to wheel to the left, thereby taking higher ground and disengaging from the marshes. The Saxon army, now being forced to draw towards the right, left its advantageous positions on the high ground.
Yeah, you got to turn to face him, but do you really need to leave your high positions? I'm not familiar with the situation enough to know for sure, but that seemed like a rather dangerous thing to do when you're up against an enemy that is as formidable as Charles, who's known for being hyper-aggressive. You want every advantage you can get.
And a part of it...
Now, to be fair, this is all cavalry, so I guess that does kind of make sense. Cavalry's not going to be as effective just holding its ground on top of a hill.
Ended up in the marshes instead. At 2 p.m, the Swedish left wing began its attack. Just as Frederick IV was marching towards the Polish cavalry, he was struck by a cannonball and was taken to his tent, where he would die a few hours later. Now commanded by Welling, the Swedish left still charged the Polish cavalry thrice, completely crushing even the Winged Hussars and forcing the entire wing to rout. Afterwards, Charles took control of the left and began advancing towards the Saxon centre. To avoid being outflanked, the Saxon centre began a retreat. However, they exposed themselves to the elite Swedish infantry in the centre, which began firing destructive volleys at them, dealing massive casualties. The Saxon retreat was made even more difficult by the marshland which was behind their initial position, and the Swedish...
Another disaster for the Saxons. Even though they outnumbered significantly, they started out with geographic advantage in just about every conceivable way, and they still managed to lose. I don't know if that says a lot about Charles XII's tactical ability, or a lot about how foolish Augustus was, or the relative ability of the two armies, but that's pretty embarrassing. And it's not the first time. They just keep losing and losing, despite having just about every advantage possible on paper, except maybe the best army, best discipline.
British soldiers used that opportunity to shoot as many of them down as possible.
On this is going to go really bad.
The Saxon cavalry...
That cavalry's in serious trouble now.
Attacked the Swedish right wing. Though the Saxons initially had the upper hand there, they were repulsed by the Swedish right and were forced to retreat. As the main Saxon army had already routed, their left ran into the rest of the Swedish army on their retreat. The Saxon left bravely fought to escape from their encirclement. However, they lost many men to the fire from the Swedish infantry in the process. In the end, the winning Swedish army lost less than 1,000 men, while the Saxons lost 3,700, 1,700 of whom were captured. The exact number of Polish casualties is unknown. However, they are noted to have been great. The Swedish army also ended up in possession of the 46 Saxon artillery pieces and their war chest. That's
not good, so Charles is really building up a lot of artillery. He got the Russian artillery, now he's got the Saxon artillery. He's really making out like a bandit in all this.
Augustus's downplaying of the danger which the Swedish army posed to his own cost him the advantageous initial position. That, combined with the superiority of the Swedish soldiers and Charles's tactical acumen, proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the Saxon-Polish army. Augustus retreated with what was left of his army to Sandomierz, hoping to get more support from the Diet there, while on the 31st of July, Charles entered Krakow. The Battle of Klisov marked the last time that the famed Winged Hussars were used in battle.
And that's too bad. Like I said, those guys impressed me.
Symbolically, It would also mark the beginning of the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This decisive victory brought Charles one step closer to a complete victory, which seemed impossible less than 2 years ago. Not all was good for the Swedish though, as trouble was brewing in the north once again. But that is the story for our next documentary, which will come soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Alright, please consider supporting Kings and Generals by heading over to their channel and subscribing if you're interested in this kind of stuff, or at very least take a look at their original video and give them a like. We really want to encourage these guys to keep making excellent products like this. I said this in the last video, I'll say it again in this one. These guys are really good at getting into the deep dives of this type of history, better than many of the other channels I've ever seen. This is not my cup of tea, so to speak, but I recognize it for being a really good educational material. If you want to know the details, who's in charge, what forces were involved, the casualty rates, all of that, very few channels get into that kind of detail the way this one does. But we really want to encourage them to keep doing what they do. And they make a lot of long-form videos, very long-form videos, and that kind of works against them sometimes, so they need all the support they can get. Anyway, enough about that. I will see you guys all tomorrow with part 3 of this series, as well as another entry into my side series that I'm doing alongside this on the atomic era and or nuclear accidents, things of that nature, as a way of building up to oversimplified Cold War coming up the next weekend. So until then, thank you for joining me. Bye-bye.